The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground at Buckingham Palace as James Mitchell stood at attention, his scarlet tunic pristine and his bearskin hat sitting perfectly atop his head. He had been a member of the Queen's Guard for 3 years now, and the weight of tradition rested on his shoulders as heavily as the ceremonial uniform he wore. Every day, tourists from around the world gathered to watch the guards perform their duties with unwavering precision and discipline. James had grown accustomed to the constant attention, the flashing cameras, and the occasional attempts by visitors to make him break his stoic composure. He had mastered the art of remaining perfectly still, his face an emotionless mask, his eyes fixed straight ahead. It was a point of pride among the guards to never react, and no matter what happened around them. They were living statues, symbols of British military excellence and royal dedication. On this particular morning in late summer, the crowds were especially thick. School holidays meant families had traveled from every corner of the globe to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Children pointed excitedly at the guards in their distinctive uniforms, while parents snapped photographs and video recordings. James could hear snippets of conversation in dozens of different languages, a constant reminder of how his role transcended national boundaries and had become a symbol recognized worldwide. As the ceremony began, James moved with practiced precision through the familiar routines. Every step had been rehearsed countless times, every movement choreographed to perfection. But the band played traditional military marches, their brass instruments gleaming in the sunlight. The rhythm of the drums matched the beating of James's heart as he marched in perfect synchronization with his fellow guardsmen. Among the crowd that day was a delegation of foreign military officers who had come to London for an international defense conference. They stood in a specially designated area, their own uniforms marking them as visitors of importance. Most watched with professional interest, analyzing the precision and discipline on display. Military ceremonies were a universal language, and these officers could appreciate the skill and dedication required to perform at such a high level. One officer in particular seemed more interested than the others. The Colonel Viktor Petrov of the Russian Armed Forces had a reputation for being difficult and demanding. He had served in conflicts around the world and carried himself with an air of superiority that his colleagues found off-putting. Petrov believed that military traditions should command respect, but he also believed that respect should flow in both directions, from junior to senior ranks across all nations and services. As James completed a turn and came to a halt near where the foreign officers stood, Petrov suddenly stepped forward. The movement caught James's peripheral vision, but he remained focused straight ahead, as training dictated. Then something unexpected happened. Petrov's voice rang out, sharp and commanding in accented English. "Guard! You will salute me immediately." The words cut through the ambient noise of the crowd like a knife. Conversations stopped. Cameras swung toward the unfolding scene. James felt the eyes of hundreds of people suddenly focused on him, waiting to see what would happen next. His heart rate increased slightly, but his face remained impassive. This was not part of the ceremony. This was not part of any protocol he had been taught. British Royal Guards do not salute while on ceremonial duty unless specific circumstances require it. They do not respond to commands from foreign officers. They do not break their composure for anything short of a genuine emergency. These rules had been drilled into James during his training, and he had followed them without question for 3 years. Petrov stepped closer, his face growing red with apparent indignation. "I said, salute. I am a colonel in the Russian Armed Forces, and you will show proper military respect." The tension in the air became palpable. Other members of the foreign delegation shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to intervene. British security personnel began moving closer, alert to a potential incident. The crowd's excited chatter had turned to nervous murmurs. Everyone sensed that something significant was happening, though most did not understand the full implications. James remained perfectly still, his rifle held at the precise angle required by regulation, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. Inside, his mind was racing. He had been trained for many scenarios, but this particular situation had never been covered in any briefing. An order from a foreign officer during a ceremonial duty was unprecedented in his experience. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. Petrov's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He was clearly not accustomed to having his commands ignored, and the public nature of this perceived defiance made it even more intolerable to him. Finally, a British liaison officer who had been assigned to escort the foreign delegation hurried forward. Captain Robert Thompson had spent years in diplomatic military roles and had seen his share of international incidents. He knew that this situation needed to be defused quickly before it escalated into something that could damage international relations. "Colonel Petrov," Thompson said smoothly, placing himself between the Russian officer and James. "Perhaps I can explain our ceremonial protocols. The Queen's Guard maintains specific traditions during their duties, and responding to external commands is not part of those traditions. I assure you, no disrespect is intended toward you or your rank." Petrov turned his glare from James to Thompson. "In my country, a junior soldier salutes a senior officer. This is basic military discipline. This guard is showing contempt for military rank and for international military courtesy." Thompson kept his voice calm and professional. "I understand your perspective, Colonel. However, these guards are performing a ceremonial role that has very specific parameters. They represent the monarchy and operate under special orders that supersede normal military protocol during their duty hours. It's similar to how guards at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in various countries maintain their posts without deviation." The comparison seemed to give Petrov pause. He was familiar with similar ceremonial duties in his own country, where guards maintained rigid discipline and did not break protocol for anyone. But his pride had been engaged, and backing down in front of a crowd was difficult for a man of his temperament. "This is an insult," Petrov insisted, though his voice had lost some of its sharp edge. "An international insult to me and to my country." James continued to stand at attention throughout this exchange, giving no indication that he was even aware of the conversation happening mere feet from him. This ability to maintain composure was exactly what had made him an excellent candidate for the Queen's Guard, and he could shut out distractions and focus entirely on his duty, no matter what chaos swirled around him. Other members of the Russian delegation now approached, clearly hoping to smooth over the situation. A younger officer, Major Alexei Volkov, spoke quietly to Petrov in Russian, gesturing toward James and then toward Thompson. Whatever he said seemed to have some effect, as Petrov's rigid posture relaxed slightly. Thompson seized the opportunity. "Colonel, if you would like to learn more about our ceremonial traditions, I would be honored to arrange a private briefing later today. We have a rich military history, and I think you would find the reasoning behind our protocols quite interesting. Many of them date back centuries and have fascinating origins." This offer provided Petrov with a graceful exit from the confrontation. He could reframe his interest as professional curiosity rather than personal offense. After a long moment, he gave a curt nod. "Very well, I will accept this briefing. But understand that in the Russian military, we would never tolerate such a breach of respect between officers and soldiers." Thompson smiled diplomatically. "Every military has its own traditions, Colonel. That diversity is part of what makes international military cooperation both challenging and rewarding." As the foreign officers moved away, the crowd's tension began to ease. Phones and cameras that had been recording the confrontation were lowered. Conversations resumed, though now everyone was discussing what they had just witnessed. The ceremony continued, with James and his fellow guards executing their movements as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had occurred, and its effects would ripple out in ways that no one present could have anticipated. As James stood his post for the remainder of his duty shift, he replayed the incident in his mind. He had done what his training required, what his oath demanded. He had maintained the dignity and discipline of the Queen's Guard without wavering. Yet he also understood Petrov's perspective in a way. Military culture places enormous importance on rank and hierarchy. In most contexts, a junior enlisted soldier would indeed salute a senior officer, regardless of nationality. The ceremonial exception that applied to the Queen's Guard was unusual, even unique in some respects. To someone unfamiliar with this specific tradition, it could easily appear as insubordination or disrespect. And when James's shift ended and he returned to the guardhouse to change out of his ceremonial uniform, he found himself at the center of attention from his fellow guardsmen. Everyone had heard about the incident with the Russian colonel. Some thought it was amusing, others found it troubling. Their commanding officer, Major Elizabeth Hartley, called James into her office for a debriefing. "You did exactly right, Guardsman Mitchell," she told him, her tone approving. "You maintained your post and followed protocol perfectly. That's precisely what we expect from the Queen's Guard." "Thank you, ma'am," James replied. "But if I may ask, what happens now?" The colonel seemed quite upset. Major Hartley leaned back in her chair, considering her response. "That's being handled at higher levels. Captain Thompson is a skilled diplomat, and he'll ensure that Colonel Petrov understands our traditions. This isn't the first time we've had misunderstandings with foreign military personnel, and it won't be the last. The important thing is that you represented the Guard and the Crown with honor." As James left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was not quite finished. There was something about the intensity in Petrov's eyes, the depth of his perceived offense, that suggested the Russian colonel was not someone who let things go easily. And James was right to be concerned, because this encounter was only the beginning of a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he understood about duty, honor, and the bridges that can be built across cultural and national divides. That evening, as London's lights began to twinkle across the city, and diplomatic channels were already humming with activity, the incident had been noted by multiple observers, including journalists who specialized in military affairs. While it had not escalated into a major confrontation, it had the potential to become a minor embarrassment for both British and Russian military relations if not handled properly. Captain Thompson prepared for his briefing with Colonel Petrov, gathering materials about the history of the Queen's Guard, the specific protocols they followed, and the reasoning behind their ceremonial duties. He knew that education and understanding would be more effective than defensiveness or dismissal of Petrov's concerns. Meanwhile, James returned to his apartment in the city, still in his regular military uniform. He lived modestly, as most junior enlisted soldiers did, or sharing a flat with another guardsman. As he prepared a simple dinner, he found his mind drifting back to the morning's events. He thought about Petrov's face, the genuine anger and offense he had shown. It made James wonder about the colonel's own military experience, what had shaped his strong views on military protocol and respect. In a hotel across London, Colonel Petrov sat in his room, still fuming about the morning's encounter. To him, the incident represented everything he disliked about Western military culture, what he perceived as a casual attitude toward rank and discipline, dressed up in ceremonial pageantry. In the Russian military, hierarchy was absolute. An order was an order, and respect flowed upward without exception. Yet even as he stewed in his indignation, a small part of Petrov's mind acknowledged that perhaps there was more to understand about the situation. He had traveled enough to know that every culture had its own logic, its own way of organizing military life. The briefing Thompson had offered might at least provide some context, even if it did not excuse what Petrov still saw as a breach of proper military decorum. As night fell over London, three men, James, Thompson, and Petrov, each contemplated the day's events from their own perspectives. None of them knew yet that their paths would cross again, or that the simple confrontation at Buckingham Palace would ultimately lead to a moment of profound understanding and mutual respect that would change how all three viewed their military service and the invisible bonds that connect soldiers across all borders and allegiances. The stage was set for something unexpected, something that would transform a moment of conflict into an opportunity for genuine human connection. But that transformation would require time, patience, and a willingness from all parties to see beyond their immediate assumptions and discover the deeper truths that united them despite their differences. The next morning, Captain Thompson arrived at the conference center where the International Military Summit was taking place. He carried a leather portfolio containing historical documents, photographs, and detailed explanations of British ceremonial military traditions. He had stayed up late the previous night refining his presentation, knowing that this meeting with Colonel Petrov could either smooth over the incident or make it worse. Petrov was already waiting in the small conference room that had been reserved for their meeting. He sat stiffly in his chair, his uniform immaculate, his expression guarded. Thompson noticed that the colonel had brought his own aide, Major Volkov, who had been present during yesterday's confrontation. This was both good and bad. Good because Volkov seemed more reasonable than his superior, bad because it suggested Petrov was treating this as a formal military matter rather than a casual educational session. "Good morning, Colonel Petrov," Thompson said with a warm smile, extending his hand. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I hope you found your accommodations comfortable." Petrov shook his hand briefly, his grip firm and professional. "Captain Thompson, let us proceed with your briefing. I have other commitments this afternoon." Thompson took his seat and opened his portfolio. "Of course, I'll try to be both thorough and efficient." He pulled out a historical photograph showing Victorian-era guardsmen. The traditions of the Queen's Guard date back hundreds of years, to a time when the monarchy faced real threats and the Guards were functional military units rather than ceremonial ones. As Thompson began to explain the evolution of the Guard's role, from active military protection to symbolic representation of the crown, he watched Petrov's face for any sign of engagement or understanding. The colonel listened without expression, occasionally jotting notes on a small pad he had brought with him. "The key point," Thompson continued, "is that when a guardsman is on ceremonial duty, he is not functioning as an individual soldier subject to the normal chain of command. He is, in a very real sense, an extension of the crown itself. His duty is to maintain the dignity and tradition of that role, which means not breaking character or protocol for any reason short of an emergency." "And who determines what constitutes an emergency?" Petrov asked, his first real engagement with the material. "The Guard himself must make that judgment in the moment," Thompson replied. "But the training is very clear. Physical threats, medical emergencies, actual attacks on the palace, these would all warrant breaking protocol. Verbal commands from anyone, regardless of rank or nationality, do not fall into that category." Petrov frowned. "So a general could walk up to one of these guards and order him to attention. And the guard would ignore him? If the general were British and part of the military command structure, there are protocols for that situation," Thompson explained. "But yes, in general the guards maintain their ceremonial stance unless properly relieved through official channels. It's similar to how an honor guard at a military funeral maintains position throughout the ceremony, or how guards at national monuments remain at their posts despite distractions." Major Volkov leaned forward slightly. "Captain, may I ask a question?" "Of course. In your view, what is the purpose of such rigidity? Surely military discipline can be maintained while also showing proper courtesy to visiting officers." Thompson appreciated the thoughtful nature of the question. That's an excellent point, Major. The purpose is multifaceted. First, it ensures absolute consistency in the ceremony, which is important because millions of people witness these guards each year. If they responded to some requests and not others, where would the line be drawn? Second, it protects the guards themselves. If they had discretion to respond to commands, they would constantly be making difficult decisions about whose orders to follow and whose to ignore. The current system removes that burden. They simply maintain their post, period. But it creates the impression of disrespect, Petrov interjected, especially to those unfamiliar with your peculiar traditions. I won't argue with that, Thompson said honestly. In an ideal world, every visitor would understand the context before interacting with the guards. We do provide information to tour groups and post signs explaining the protocols, but obviously not everyone reads them or understands the significance. Yesterday's situation was unfortunate, and I sincerely apologize that you felt disrespected. That was never the guard's intention. Something in Thompson's sincere tone seemed to reach Petrov. His rigid posture softened slightly. The guard himself. What is his name? Thompson hesitated. Guardsman James Mitchell, sir. He's been with the Queen's Guard for 3 years and has an exemplary service record. And he was following orders by ignoring my command? He was following the protocols of his post. Yes, protocols that have been in place long before he joined the service. Petrov was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Finally, he spoke again. In the Russian military, we also have ceremonial guards. At the Kremlin, at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. They too maintain rigid discipline, but we make clear to visitors that these are special circumstances. As do we, Thompson agreed, though clearly not clearly enough given yesterday's misunderstanding. Major Volkov spoke up again. Colonel, if I may, I believe Captain Thompson has made a good case that this was a cultural misunderstanding rather than deliberate disrespect. The British Guard was simply doing his duty as he understood it. Petrov gave his aide a sharp look, but then nodded slowly. Perhaps there is some truth in that. He turned back to Thompson. But you must understand, Captain, that in military culture, rank means something. It is not just decoration. It represents years of service, sacrifice, and earned authority. To have a junior soldier appear to dismiss that authority, even for ceremonial reasons, nigh is deeply troubling. I understand completely, Thompson said. And in any other context, Guardsman Mitchell would absolutely salute an officer of your rank and experience. May I ask, Colonel, how long have you served? 32 years, Petrov said with obvious pride. I have served in 3 conflicts and held command positions in some of the most difficult postings in the Russian military. That's remarkable, Thompson said genuinely. 32 years of service represents an extraordinary commitment to your country and to military excellence. Guardsman Mitchell, by comparison, is just beginning his career. Under normal circumstances, showing proper respect to an officer of your caliber would be not just appropriate but required. The acknowledgement of his service and experience seemed to have a notable effect on Petrov. His expression softened further, and he leaned back in his chair with a long exhale. You are a skilled diplomat, Captain Thompson. You have made your case well. I appreciate that, sir. But I want to be clear. My goal is not to make excuses or win an argument. It's to ensure that you understand that what happened yesterday was not personal and was not meant as disrespect to you, your rank, or your nation. It was simply the execution of a very specific ceremonial duty that has its own unique rules. Volkov smiled slightly. I think, Captain, that you have succeeded in that goal, at least from my perspective. Petrov shot his aide another look, but there was less sharpness in it this time. Major Volkov may be correct. I may have overreacted to the situation. but military pride can sometimes cloud judgment. Thompson knew better than to agree too enthusiastically with this admission. Instead, he simply nodded. We all have moments when our professional pride makes us react strongly. It's part of what makes us effective military officers. We care deeply about our service and our standards. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Thompson showing Petrov various documents and photographs that illustrated the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. Petrov asked increasingly thoughtful questions, and the tension that had characterized the beginning of the meeting gradually dissipated. As they prepared to conclude, Petrov stood and offered his hand to Thompson. Thank you for taking the time to educate me, Captain. I still believe that military protocols should allow for basic courtesy between officers and soldiers of all nations. But I now understand that your ceremonial guards operate under a different set of rules. Thank you for being willing to listen, Colonel, Thompson replied, shaking his hand firmly. If there's anything else we can do to make your stay in London more pleasant, please don't hesitate to let me know. As Petrov and Volkov left the conference room, Thompson felt a sense of relief wash over him. The situation had been diffused, at least for now. But he couldn't help wondering if Petrov's acceptance of the explanation was complete, or if some residual resentment remained. What Thompson didn't know was that Petrov's thoughts were indeed conflicted. On one hand, he intellectually accepted Thompson's explanation of British ceremonial protocol. On the other hand, the emotional sting of what he had perceived as public disrespect still lingered. Petrov was a man who prided himself on his ability to command respect, and the image of that young British guard standing immobile while he issued commands continued to eat at him. Major Volkov, walking beside his superior back to their hotel, could sense this inner conflict. Sir, if I may speak freely? You may, Petrov said curtly. I think Captain Thompson made excellent points. The British Guard was simply following his orders, as any good soldier would. There was no personal disrespect intended. So you have said already, Alexei. I understand the argument. But you still feel the sting of it. Petrov stopped walking and turned to face his aide. Yes, I do. Is that so wrong? I am a colonel in the Russian armed forces. I have commanded men in combat. I have earned my rank through decades of service. And a guardsman, barely more than a boy, ignored a direct command from me in front of hundreds of witnesses. Understanding the reasons does not erase the feeling. Volkov chose his words carefully. No, sir, it doesn't erase the feeling. But perhaps it puts it in proper context. The guard wasn't rejecting you personally. He was upholding his own duty, just as you have upheld yours for 32 years. In a way, his steadfast adherence to his orders, even under pressure, is something you might respect. Petrov considered this for a long moment. You are very wise for your years, Major. Perhaps too wise for your own good. But there was no real anger in his voice, and when they resumed walking, his steps were lighter than before. Back at Buckingham Palace, James Mitchell was preparing for another day of ceremonial duty. He had heard through the informal network of guardsmen that Captain Thompson had met with the Russian colonel, and that the situation had been smoothed over. But James couldn't quite put the incident out of his mind. Something about the encounter had affected him more deeply than he had initially realized. As he stood in front of the mirror adjusting his bearskin hat, another guardsman, Corporal David Hughes, came to stand beside him. You all right, mate? You've been quiet since yesterday. Yeah, I'm fine, James said. Just thinking about that Russian colonel, the way he looked at me. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt. Hurt? Come on, James. He was a pompous officer who got told no for probably the first time in his career. Don't lose sleep over it. I don't know, David. I've been thinking about what he said, about respect and military rank. In a way, he wasn't wrong. In any other context, I would absolutely salute an officer like that. It must have felt like a real slap in the face to him. Hughes shrugged. Maybe, but you were doing your job. That's all that matters. James nodded, but the conversation stayed with him as he took his post later that morning. As tourists gathered and cameras clicked, he found himself thinking about Colonel Petrov. What was the colonel's story? What had his 32 years of service been like? What had he seen and experienced that had shaped his strong views on military protocol? These thoughts represented a shift in James's understanding of his role. Before yesterday, he had seen his duty as purely about maintaining tradition and ceremonial dignity. Now he was beginning to grasp that his actions, however ceremonially prescribed, had real effects on real people. The Russian colonel was not just an obstacle to his duty, he was a human being with his own history, his own pride, his own sense of what military service meant. This realization would prove significant in the days to come, as events would bring James and Petrov together again in circumstances that neither of them could have anticipated. The seeds of understanding had been planted, both in the Russian colonel's gradual acceptance of British traditions and in the British Guard's growing empathy for the perspective of foreign officers. What remained to be seen was whether those seeds would take root and grow into something meaningful, or whether the initial conflict would remain an isolated incident, remembered only as a minor diplomatic hiccup during an international conference. The answer would come soon enough in a moment of crisis that would test not just military protocols and ceremonial traditions, but the fundamental values of courage, sacrifice, and the brotherhood that can exist between soldiers regardless of the flags. 3 days after the confrontation at Buckingham Palace, Colonel Petrov found himself attending a gala dinner hosted by the British Ministry of Defense. The event was designed to foster goodwill between military officers from various nations attending the defense conference. The grand ballroom of the historic hotel was filled with uniforms from dozens of countries, medals gleaming under crystal chandeliers, and the low murmur of professional conversation mixing with the gentle sounds of a string quartet. Petrov stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the London streets below, nursing a glass of vodka that he had specifically requested. Major Volkov was somewhere in the crowd, networking with other junior officers as was expected at these events. Petrov preferred solitude at such gatherings, finding small talk tiresome and the forced diplomacy exhausting. He was watching the street below when he noticed a familiar figure in civilian clothes walking along the sidewalk. Even without the distinctive scarlet tunic and bearskin hat, Petrov recognized the posture and bearing of Guardsman James Mitchell. The young man was walking with purpose, his military background evident in every step despite his casual attire. Something made Petrov continue watching. Perhaps it was curiosity about the man who had been the center of his frustration days earlier. Perhaps it was simply the boredom of the gala. Whatever the reason, Petrov's attention was fixed on the street below when everything changed in an instant. A black sedan came speeding down the street, moving far too fast for the narrow London road. Petrov could hear the squeal of tires even through the thick glass of the ballroom windows. He watched as the car swerved suddenly, mounting the sidewalk directly in the path of a woman pushing a stroller with a small child. Time seemed to slow. The woman's face registered shock and terror. She tried to push the stroller out of the way, but there wasn't time. The car was going to hit them. There was no doubt in Petrov's mind. He found himself pressing against the glass, helpless to do anything but witness the tragedy about to unfold. Then James Mitchell moved. The young guardsman had been perhaps 10 meters away when the car jumped the curb. Without hesitation, without visible thought or calculation, he sprinted forward with explosive speed. In the space of heartbeats, he reached the woman and child, shoving the stroller with tremendous force away from the car's path, while simultaneously grabbing the woman and pulling her back. The black sedan clipped James's shoulder, spinning him around and throwing him several meters down the sidewalk. The car, now out of control, smashed into a lamppost with a sickening crunch of metal. The woman and child, and now safely on the pavement several meters away, were shaken but unharmed. Petrov was already moving before his conscious mind registered what he was doing. He pushed through the crowd of officers, ignoring their surprised looks, and headed for the exit. Major Volkov, noticing his colonel's sudden departure, quickly followed. Within moments, both Russian officers were out on the street, running toward the scene of the accident. By the time they arrived, a small crowd had gathered. The woman was crying, clutching her child while thanking James profusely. The driver of the car was emerging from the wreckage, dazed but apparently uninjured, and James Mitchell was sitting on the curb, his left arm held gingerly against his body, his face pale with shock and pain. Petrov dropped to one knee beside the young guardsman. "That's you there! Can you hear me? Are you badly hurt?" James looked up, and recognition flashed across his face despite the pain. "Colonel Petrov? What are you doing here?" "I saw what happened from the window above. That was remarkably brave. How badly are you injured?" "My shoulder," James said through gritted teeth. "I think it might be dislocated or broken. But the woman and her child, are they all right?" "They appear fine, thanks to you," Volkov said, kneeling on James's other side. "Do not try to move. An ambulance is surely on its way." Indeed, sirens could already be heard in the distance. The woman James had saved approached, still holding her child tightly. "Thank you," she kept saying, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you so much. You saved our lives. You saved my baby." James managed a weak smile despite his obvious pain. I'm just glad I was close enough to help, ma'am." Petrov found himself studying the young guardsman with new eyes. 3 days ago, he had seen this man as a symbol of disrespect, a junior soldier who had defied his command. Now, watching James try to reassure the woman even while clearly in significant pain himself, Petrov saw something entirely different. He saw courage. He saw selflessness. He saw the kind of instant, unthinking heroism that defined the very best of military service. The ambulance arrived quickly, and paramedics began assessing James's injuries. As they prepared to transport him to the hospital, James looked at Petrov. "Sir, I know this might sound strange, but thank you for staying with me. You didn't have to do that." Petrov shook his head slowly. "On the contrary, Guardsman Mitchell, it is I who should thank you. You have reminded me of something important today." "What's that, sir?" "What it truly means to be a soldier." Petrov stood and stepped back to allow the paramedics to work. "Major Volkov and I will follow the ambulance to the hospital. We will ensure that you receive proper care." "That's really not necessary, sir. I'm sure I'll be fine." "Nevertheless, we will do so." As the ambulance pulled away, Volkov looked at his colonel with barely concealed surprise. "Sir, we're leaving the gala? There are important people there who will notice our absence." "Then they will notice," Petrov said firmly. "Right now, there is nowhere more important for me to be than ensuring that young man is cared for properly. He is a hero, Alexei, a true hero. The least we can do is stand with him." They arrived at the hospital emergency department shortly after the ambulance. While James was taken for x-rays and examination, Petrov and Volkov waited in the lobby. The colonel paced restlessly, his mind turning over what he had witnessed. The speed of James's reaction, the complete absence of hesitation, the willingness to put himself in harm's way to protect strangers, these were the qualities that Petrov had spent his entire career trying to instill in the soldiers under his command. After about an hour, a doctor emerged and approached them. "Are you family of James Mitchell?" "We are fellow military officers," Petrov explained. "We witnessed his act of heroism and wanted to ensure he is well cared for." "How is he?" "He has a separated shoulder and some bruising, but no breaks or serious internal injuries. He was very fortunate. We've put his shoulder back in place and given him pain medication. He'll need to rest it for several weeks, but he should make a full recovery. May we see him?" The doctor considered this, then nodded. I think he would appreciate the company. He's in examination room 3. They found James sitting on the edge of an examination table, his left arm in a sling, looking tired but alert. When he saw Petrov and Volkov enter, he tried to stand, but Petrov waved him back down. "Please, do not strain yourself. We came only to check on your condition." "That's very kind of you, sir," James said. "I appreciate it more than you know." Petrov pulled up a chair and sat down, gesturing for Volkov to do the same. For a long moment, the 3 men sat in silence. Finally, Petrov spoke, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that surprised even himself. "Guardsman Mitchell, I owe you an apology. 3 days ago, I judged you harshly based on a misunderstanding of your duties and traditions. I saw only what I perceived as disrespect, without understanding the context or the character of the man behind the uniform." James shook his head. "Sir, you don't need to apologize. You had every right to expect proper military courtesy. I understood your frustration, even if I couldn't break protocol to address it." "No," Petrov insisted. "I do need to apologize because what I witnessed today showed me the truth about you. When that car threatened those innocent people, you did not think about protocol or ceremony. You did not consider your own safety or calculate the risks. You simply acted, with courage and selflessness. That is the mark of a true soldier, regardless of nation or uniform." "I just did what anyone would do in that situation, sir." Volkov smiled. "With respect, guardsman, that is not true. Most people would have frozen or hesitated or protected themselves. You ran toward danger without thought for your own safety. That is exceptional, not ordinary." "Major Volkov is correct," Petrov added. "And seeing your actions today has made me realize something important. The discipline you showed 3 days ago, standing at your post and maintaining your duty despite my commands, that same discipline, that same dedication to your responsibilities, is what enabled you to act so decisively today. You are a soldier who understands duty at a fundamental level. Whether that duty is ceremonial tradition or protecting innocent lives, you execute it without hesitation." James was quiet for a moment, absorbing these words. "Colonel, can I ask you something? Captain Thompson told me you've served for 32 years. What made you choose military service? What has kept you dedicated to it for so long?" Petrov leaned back in his chair, surprised by the question, but willing to answer it. "I grew up in a small town in Russia, in difficult times. The military offered structure, purpose, and the opportunity to serve something greater than myself. Over the years, I have seen the best and worst of humanity. I have seen soldiers sacrifice everything for their comrades. I have seen cowardice and courage, honor and betrayal. Through it all, what has kept me in service is the belief that military values, discipline, loyalty, sacrifice, are essential to a functioning society." "And do you think those values are universal?" James asked. "That they exist across all militaries, all nations?" "I used to think they were unique to certain military traditions," Petrov admitted. "I believed that the Russian military, with our history and our culture, had a special claim to these values. But today you have shown me that true military virtue transcends borders. You are British, I am Russian. We serve different flags, different systems of government. Yet the courage you displayed today, the selflessness, these are the same values I have tried to embody and teach throughout my career." Volkov nodded. "It is something we all sometimes forget in the modern world, where national rivalries and political differences dominate the headlines. But at its core, military service is about protecting others, about being willing to stand in harm's way so that others do not have to. That purpose unites us across all boundaries." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, ranging across topics of military life, the challenges of modern service, and the ways different nations approached military training and tradition. Petrov found himself genuinely enjoying the discussion, appreciating James's thoughtful questions and honest reflections on his own experiences. Eventually, a nurse came in to inform them that James would be discharged soon and should rest at home. As Petrov and Volkov prepared to leave, the colonel reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small medallion. It bore the emblem of his regiment, a unit with a distinguished history dating back to World War II. "Guardsman Mitchell, I would like you to have this," Petrov said, holding out the medallion. "It belonged to my father, who served in the Great Patriotic War. He gave it to me when I joined the military, and it has accompanied me throughout my career. I want you to have it as a token of my respect and as my apology for misjudging you." James looked stunned. "Sir, I couldn't possibly accept this. It's clearly very important to you and your family." "Which is precisely why I want you to have it," Petrov insisted. "Today you reminded me what truly matters in military service. This medallion should be carried by someone who embodies those values. That someone is you." With trembling hands, James accepted the medallion. He turned it over, in examining the worn metal and the Cyrillic inscription he couldn't read. "Colonel, I don't know what to say. Thank you. I will treasure this. Just continue to serve with the same courage and dedication you showed today," Petrov said. "That is all the thanks I need." As Petrov and Volkov left the hospital and stepped out into the cool London evening, the major looked at his colonel with open admiration. "That was a generous gesture, sir. I know how much that medallion meant to you." "It still means a great deal to me," Petrov acknowledged. "But it belongs with someone who will honor what it represents. That young guardsman is the kind of soldier every military needs. He makes me think that perhaps there is hope for the next generation after all." They walked in companionable silence for a while, heading back toward their hotel, and the streets of London were busy with evening traffic and pedestrians heading home or out for the night. Petrov found himself looking at the city with fresh eyes, seeing past the foreign architecture and unfamiliar customs to the common humanity underneath. "You know, Alexei," he said eventually, "when I arrived in London last week, I was convinced that Western military culture was inferior to our own, soft, ceremonial, more concerned with appearances than with genuine discipline. Today has taught me that my assumptions were wrong." "One act of heroism changes your entire view?" Volkov asked, not challenging but curious. "No, not one act, but what that act revealed. The discipline Guardsman Mitchell showed in maintaining his post despite my commands and the courage he showed today, these are connected. They spring from the same source, a deeply ingrained sense of duty and service. His military training taught him to put duty above personal comfort or even personal safety. That training served him well when the moment of crisis came. So you no longer see the ceremonial guards as mere pageantry? I see them as soldiers who understand something profound. That duty takes many forms, but the core principle remains constant. Whether you are protecting a physical palace or preserving a centuries-old tradition, you are serving something larger than yourself. The British have maintained these traditions not out of empty nostalgia, but because they understand that such traditions connect the present to the past and provide stability and continuity in an ever-changing world. Volkov smiled. Captain Thompson would be pleased to hear you say that. Yes, he would. And he would be entitled to feel vindicated. He tried to explain these concepts to me, but I was too stubborn to truly listen. Sometimes we need to see principles in action before we can fully understand them. They reached their hotel, but before entering, Petrov paused and looked back in the direction of the hospital. I wonder if Guardsman Mitchell realizes the impact he had today. Not just on the woman and child he saved, but on me. On my understanding of what it means to be a soldier. Perhaps in time he will, Volkov suggested. For now, I think he is simply focused on recovering from his injury. Yes, of course. The practical concerns must come first, but I hope our paths cross again before we return to Russia. Yet there is more I would like to say to that young man." What Petrov didn't know was that their paths would indeed cross again, and sooner than he expected. The incident had been witnessed by several people who had cameras and phones, and by the next morning, video footage of James's heroic act would be circulating on social media and news websites. The story of a British Royal Guard saving a mother and child would capture public imagination, particularly when it emerged that the Guard had sustained injuries in the process. The British military, recognizing an opportunity to highlight the courage and dedication of their service members, would organize a small ceremony to commend James for his actions. And when they learned that a Russian colonel had been present and had accompanied James to the hospital, and they would extend an invitation for Colonel Petrov to attend the ceremony as well. This would set the stage for a public reconciliation that would transcend the initial confrontation at Buckingham Palace. What had begun as a clash of military cultures and protocols would transform into a demonstration of the universal values that unite soldiers across all national boundaries. And both James Mitchell and Viktor Petrov would find their lives changed by the unexpected connection that had formed between them. But for now, on this cool London evening, both men rested in their respective locations, unaware of what was to come. James lay in his apartment, his shoulder aching despite the pain medication, holding the Russian medallion and wondering at the strange turn his life had taken. Petrov sat in his hotel room, a glass of vodka in hand, contemplating the lessons of the day and feeling the first stirrings of a perspective shift that would influence the remainder of his military career. Outside, London continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the small dramas of individual lives, yet serving as the stage upon which those dramas played out. The ancient city had seen countless moments of conflict and reconciliation, heroism and cowardice, misunderstanding and ultimate understanding. What had happened between a British guardsman and a Russian colonel was just one more thread in the vast tapestry of human experience that the city had witnessed over its long history. But for James and Victor, this thread was unique and meaningful, a reminder that beneath the uniforms and flags and national identities, there existed a common language of courage, honor, and mutual respect that could bridge any divide. They had found it in the most unexpected way, through confrontation and crisis, but they had found it nonetheless. And in finding it, both men had been changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. The morning light streamed through the windows of the Ministry of Defense office where Captain Robert Thompson sat, reading the newspapers spread across his desk. The headline of the Daily Telegraph caught his attention immediately. "Royal Guard, Hero Saves Mother and Child." Below it was a photograph, captured by a passerby, showing James Mitchell pushing the stroller to safety moments before the car struck him. Thompson read the article carefully, his professional mind already racing ahead to the implications. This was precisely the kind of positive publicity that the military valued, a concrete demonstration of the courage and quick thinking that military training instilled in service members. But what caught his attention even more was a paragraph near the end of the article mentioning that a Russian military officer, identified as Colonel Viktor Petrov, had witnessed the incident and accompanied the injured guardsman to the hospital. A slow smile spread across Thompson's face. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor. The same colonel who had been offended by James's adherence to ceremonial protocol had now witnessed the young guardsman's extraordinary courage. Thompson immediately began making phone calls, first to his superiors and then to the Russian embassy's military attaché. By noon, arrangements were being made for a commendation ceremony to honor James Mitchell's actions. The ceremony would be small and relatively informal, but it would serve multiple purposes: recognizing genuine heroism, providing positive publicity for the armed forces, and potentially turning the earlier diplomatic awkwardness with Colonel Petrov into an opportunity for improved relations. Major Elizabeth Hartley, James's commanding officer, arrived at his apartment personally to inform him of the ceremony and to check on his recovery. She found him looking tired and a bit overwhelmed by the sudden media attention. "How's the shoulder, Mitchell?" she asked, settling into a chair across from where he sat on the sofa. "Painful, ma'am, but manageable. The doctors say I should have full mobility back within a few weeks." "Good. I wanted to let you know personally that you're being formally commended for your actions. And there will be a ceremony at the Ministry of Defense in 3 days. Dress uniform, though obviously we'll make accommodations for your injured shoulder." James nodded, though he looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I appreciate the recognition, but I really was just doing what anyone would do." "That's what every hero says," Hartley replied with a slight smile. "But the facts speak for themselves. You put yourself in harm's way to protect civilians, without hesitation and without thought for your own safety. That's exactly the kind of conduct we want to recognize and celebrate." "Will it be a big event?" "Relatively small, actually. Some military brass, a few press representatives, and interestingly enough, Colonel Petrov has been invited to attend." James's eyes widened. "The Russian colonel? Really?" "Captain Thompson thought it would be appropriate, given that he witnessed your actions and showed such concern for your well-being afterward. Apparently, his perspective on you has changed considerably since the incident at the palace." "He gave me his father's medallion," James said quietly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the treasured object. "It meant a great deal to him, and he gave it to me. I'm still trying to understand why." Hartley examined the medallion with interest. "That's quite an honor, Mitchell. Sounds like you made quite an impression on the colonel." "I think maybe he made more of an impression on me, ma'am. The way he stayed with me at the hospital, and the things he said about duty and service, it made me think about my own motivations for joining the Guard." "And what conclusions have you reached?" James was quiet for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "I joined because I wanted to be part of something with history and tradition. I liked the idea of the ceremony, the pageantry, but I think I had lost sight of what all of that is supposed to represent. The traditions aren't just for show. They're meant to instill discipline and dedication that serves us in every aspect of our service. When I stood at my post and didn't respond to Colonel Petrov's command, I was following protocol. But I wasn't really thinking about why that protocol existed. Now I understand it better." Hartley nodded approvingly. "That's mature reflection, Mitchell. The best soldiers are the ones who understand not just what they're supposed to do, but why they're supposed to do it. I'll see you at the ceremony in 3 days." After she left, James sat holding the Russian medallion, turning it over in his hands. The metal was worn smooth in places from decades of handling. He wondered about Colonel Petrov's father, what he had experienced during the war, what values he had passed down to his son. The medallion was more than a piece of metal. It was a physical link to history, to sacrifice, to the continuity of military service across generations. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to find Major Alexei Volkov standing in the hallway, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Major Volkov, this is unexpected. Please, come in." Volkov entered, glancing around the modest apartment. "Thank you, Guardsman Mitchell. I hope I am not intruding. Colonel Petrov sent me to check on your recovery and to deliver a message." "I'm recovering well, thank you. Please, have a seat. Can I offer you tea or coffee?" "Tea would be nice, thank you." As James moved carefully to the kitchen, favoring his injured shoulder, Volkov continued, "The colonel wanted me to tell you that he has been invited to your commendation ceremony and that he is very honored to attend. He also wanted me to assure you that he will be conducting himself with appropriate diplomatic decorum this time." James couldn't help but smile at this. "I appreciate that, Major, though I'm certain the colonel will behave perfectly, and please tell him that I'm honored he'll be there." His presence means a great deal to me." As James returned with the tea, Volkov studied him with open curiosity. "If you do not mind my asking, guardsman, what went through your mind when you saw that car heading toward the woman and child? Did you think about the danger to yourself?" "Honestly, Major, I didn't think at all. It was pure instinct. I saw the threat, and I reacted. It wasn't until afterward, sitting on the curb with my shoulder screaming in pain, that I really processed what had happened." "That is the mark of good training," Volkov observed. "In crisis situations, we do not have time for conscious deliberation. We act on instinct and training. Your instinct was to protect others, even at cost to yourself. That speaks to who you are as a person and as a soldier." They talked for over an hour, and the conversation ranging from their respective military experiences to their views on international relations and the role of military service in modern society. James found Volkov to be thoughtful and surprisingly open about the challenges facing the Russian military. "May I ask you something, Major?" James said eventually. "Colonel Petrov strikes me as a very proud man. Someone who values rank and hierarchy very highly. How did he react privately to what happened at Buckingham Palace?" Volkov smiled ruefully. He was quite angry, as you might imagine. But I think what bothered him most was not the perceived disrespect itself, but his own reaction to it. The colonel is hard on others, but he is even harder on himself. After his meeting with Captain Thompson, he spent hours reflecting on his behavior and his assumptions. And seeing the car accident changed his perspective? Dramatically. The colonel has always valued courage and selflessness in soldiers. When he saw you risk your life for strangers, it forced him to reconsider his initial judgment of you. He realized that he had let pride and ego cloud his assessment of your character. That kind of self-awareness is difficult for any military officer, especially one with Colonel Petrov's seniority and experience. "I understand that," James said. "I think we all struggle with pride sometimes. The challenge is recognizing when it's leading us astray." When Volkov finally left, James found himself energized despite his physical discomfort. And the conversation had given him new insights into Colonel Petrov, and had deepened his appreciation for the Russian officer's journey from offense to understanding. It also made him more eager for the upcoming ceremony, where he would have the opportunity to see the colonel again. The 3 days before the ceremony passed quickly. James spent most of his time resting his shoulder and fielding calls from family members and friends who had seen the news coverage. His parents, who lived in Yorkshire, were simultaneously proud and worried. His mother wanted to come down to London to care for him, but he gently discouraged her, assuring her that he was managing fine on his own. On the morning of the ceremony, James dressed carefully in his uniform, struggling somewhat with the left sleeve due to his injured shoulder. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie and checking his appearance with the same attention to detail he brought to his ceremonial duties. The young man looking back at him seemed somehow different from the one who had stood at Buckingham Palace just over a week ago, though he couldn't quite articulate how. The ceremony was held in a formal reception room at the Ministry of Defense, a space filled with military portraits and regimental flags. When James arrived, escorted by Major Hartley, he was surprised by the number of people present. In addition to various military officials and a small press contingent, he saw Captain Thompson, several of his fellow guardsmen, and standing near the back of the room, Colonel Petrov and Major Volkov. The ceremony itself was relatively brief and formal, and a general whom James had never met read a commendation praising his extraordinary courage and selfless action in defense of civilian life. James accepted a certificate and a medal, standing at attention despite the persistent ache in his shoulder. Cameras flashed, and he did his best to maintain a professional demeanor while feeling deeply uncomfortable with the attention. But the most meaningful moment came after the formal proceedings concluded. As people began to mingle and congratulate James, Colonel Petrov approached. The room seemed to quiet slightly, people aware of the history between the British guardsman and the Russian colonel. Petrov came to attention and rendered a precise military salute. The gesture hung in the air for a long moment, heavy with significance. Then, carefully due to his injured shoulder, and James returned the salute. It was a simple exchange, the most basic form of military courtesy, but everyone present understood the deeper meaning. This was not just a salute between a junior enlisted soldier and a senior officer. It was an acknowledgement of mutual respect, a bridge built across cultural and national divides, a recognition of the common values that united them despite their different flags and uniforms. After the salutes were exchanged, Petrov extended his hand. "Congratulations on your commendation, Guardsman Mitchell. It is well deserved." "Thank you, Colonel, and thank you for being here today. Your presence honors me more than any medal." "The honor is mine," Petrov replied. "You have taught me valuable lessons about duty, courage, and the danger of making quick judgments about others. I am a better officer for having known you, however briefly." People around them had begun to take notice of the exchange. Captain Thompson approached, a broad smile on his face. "Colonel Petrov, Guardsman Mitchell, would you be willing to take a photograph together? I think it would make a powerful statement about international military cooperation and mutual respect." Both men agreed, and they posed together, flanked by Thompson and Volkov. The resulting photograph would appear in several newspapers the next day, with articles discussing how a moment of cultural misunderstanding had transformed into a demonstration of the universal values of military service. After the photograph, Petrov asked if he could speak privately with James for a few minutes. They moved to a quiet corner of the room while Volkov ran interference, in keeping other well-wishers at bay for the moment. "I want to tell you something, Guardsman Mitchell," Petrov began, his voice low and serious. "In 32 years of military service, I have known many soldiers, some brave, some cowardly, some honorable, some corrupt. But rarely have I encountered someone who embodies military virtue as completely as you do, and who does so with such apparent humility and lack of self-awareness." James started to protest, but Petrov held up a hand. "Please let me finish. When I return to Russia, I will be taking with me a new understanding of what the British military represents. Not weakness dressed as tradition, as I had previously assumed, but strength derived from continuity with the past. Your ceremonial duties are not empty pageantry. They are the visible manifestation of values that run deep and true. Colonel, I'm just a guardsman. I'm not sure I represent anything as grand as all that. That is precisely my point. You do not see yourself as special or heroic. You simply do what you believe to be right, whether that is maintaining your ceremonial post or risking your life for strangers. This consistency of character, this alignment between duty and action, is what I will remember long after I have forgotten the details of our first encounter." "You've given me a lot to think about as well, sir," James admitted. "Your perspective on military hierarchy and respect challenged me to think more deeply about why we do things the way we do. I'm a better guardsman for having met you, even if our meeting started awkwardly." Petrov smiled, an expression that transformed his usually stern face. "Yes, it was quite awkward, wasn't it? I can only imagine what the tourists thought. Watching a Russian colonel shouting at an immobile British guard. I am sure some of them captured it on video and it is circulating somewhere on the internet." "Probably," James agreed with a laugh, "though I hope they also captured what came after, the understanding and respect that grew from that moment." They talked for a while longer, with Petrov sharing stories from his own early military career and James asking thoughtful questions about the Russian military experience. By the time they rejoined the larger group, a genuine friendship had formed between them, unlikely as that would have seemed just days earlier. As the ceremony wound down and people began to leave, Thompson pulled James aside. "That was well done, guardsman. You handled yourself with grace and dignity. The photograph of you and Colonel Petrov is going to be very valuable from a public relations standpoint. But more importantly, I think it represents something genuine. You've helped turn a potential diplomatic incident into a positive story about international military cooperation. I'm just glad Colonel Petrov was willing to give me a second chance, sir, or rather to reconsider his first impression. He's a proud man, but he's also honest and willing to admit when he's wrong. That's a rare combination, especially at his rank and level of experience. You made an impression on him, Mitchell, a lasting one." As James left the Ministry of Defense that afternoon, his injured shoulder still aching but his spirit lifted by the events of the day, he found himself reflecting on the strange journey of the past week. He had gone from being the subject of a Russian colonel's anger to being the recipient of that same colonel's highest respect. He had learned that military traditions served deeper purposes than he had initially understood. He had discovered that courage came in many forms, not just in running toward danger, but in maintaining one's post under pressure and in being willing to reconsider one's assumptions. Most importantly, he had learned that the values he cherished, duty, honor, sacrifice, and respect, were not the exclusive property of any one nation or military. They were universal human values, given particular shape and expression by military service, but ultimately transcending all boundaries of nationality, rank, and cultural tradition. That evening, James sat in his apartment holding Colonel Petrov's medallion once again. But now he understood its significance in a deeper way. It was not just a Russian military object given to a British soldier. It was a symbol of the invisible bonds that connected all who served, regardless of the flags they carried or the languages they spoke. It represented the hard-won understanding that had emerged from conflict, the respect that had grown from confrontation, and the friendship that had blossomed in the most unexpected circumstances. Tomorrow, Colonel Petrov would return to Russia, and James would eventually return to his ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. Their lives would diverge, and they might never meet again. But both had been changed by their encounter. Both had learned lessons that would influence the rest of their military careers and beyond. And somewhere in the vast tapestry of human experience, this small story of two soldiers finding common ground across cultural and national divides would take its place as a reminder that understanding is always possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances, when people approach each other with openness, honesty, and a willingness to see beyond their initial assumptions. 6 months had passed since that transformative week in London, when James Mitchell and Viktor Petrov had found unexpected common ground. Winter had settled over England, bringing with it gray skies and persistent rain that seemed to seep into every corner of London's ancient streets. James had long since recovered from his shoulder injury and returned to full ceremonial duties with the Queen's Guard, though he approached his responsibilities with a deeper understanding than before. The woman he had saved, whose name he had learned was Sarah Chen, had stayed in touch. She sent him photographs of her daughter, Emma, growing and thriving, and frequently wrote to tell him how grateful she remained for his intervention. James kept these letters in a drawer in his apartment, touching reminders that his actions had made a lasting difference in real lives. But it was not Sarah's letters that occupied his thoughts on this particular gray morning. Rather, it was an unexpected email that had arrived in his inbox the previous evening. The sender was Major Alexei Volkov, and writing from Moscow with news that had shaken James more than he cared to admit. Colonel Petrov had suffered a massive heart attack while conducting field training exercises with his regiment. He had survived, thanks to the quick action of the medics on site, but his condition had been serious. He was recovering now, Volkov wrote, but the doctors had made it clear that his active duty career was over. At 54 years old, after 32 years of service, Viktor Petrov would be forced into medical retirement. James read the email multiple times, each reading bringing a fresh wave of concern for the Russian colonel who had become, against all odds, someone he considered a friend. He tried to imagine what Petrov must be feeling. A man who had built his entire identity around military service, suddenly cut off from the career that had defined him. It would be devastating. That evening, James composed a careful response to Volkov, asking if it would be appropriate for him to write to Colonel Petrov directly. The reply came quickly. The colonel would be honored to hear from him. Volkov provided a postal address, noting that while Petrov had access to email, he preferred handwritten letters for personal correspondence. James spent hours crafting his letter, starting over multiple times before finally achieving what he felt was the right tone. He wrote about his own experiences since their meeting, the ways in which Petrov's words had influenced his approach to his duties. He shared Sarah Chen's letters, describing how the colonel's gift of the medallion had become a touchstone for him, a reminder of the values they had discussed. Then he acknowledged the difficulty of forced retirement, but expressed confidence that Petrov's contributions to military service were far from over. "You taught me that military virtue is not confined to active duty," James wrote in his careful script. "It is a way of seeing the world, of approaching challenges, of treating others with respect and holding oneself to high standards. That does not end when the uniform comes off. If anything, it becomes even more important, because it is no longer enforced by regulation, but must come purely from within." He sealed the letter and posted it, unsure if it would be received well, but feeling it was important to reach out. Then he continued with his duties and his life, not expecting any further development in the story of his unlikely friendship with the Russian colonel. But the universe, it seemed, there still had surprises in store. 3 months later, on a crisp spring morning that hinted at the coming warmth of summer, James received word that he had visitors waiting for him at the guardhouse. When he arrived, still in his civilian clothes as his shift was not scheduled to begin for another hour, he found Captain Robert Thompson waiting with a knowing smile and 2 familiar figures standing beside him. Colonel Viktor Petrov and Major Alexei Volkov had returned to London. Petrov looked different from when James had last seen him. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a well-tailored suit rather than a uniform, and there was something softer about his bearing, though his military posture remained evident. The stern face James remembered had more lines now, suggesting the toll of his illness and recovery, but his eyes were alert and warm. "Colonel Petrov!" James exclaimed, crossing the room quickly to shake hands. "Major Volkov! I had no idea you were coming to London. It's wonderful to see you both." "The pleasure is mine, Guardsman Mitchell," Petrov replied, his English still heavily accented but clear. "I apologize for the surprise visit. Captain Thompson was kind enough to arrange it without informing you in advance. I hope you do not mind." "Mind? Not at all. Please, let's sit down. Can I get you anything? Tea? Coffee?" As they settled into chairs in a small conference room, Thompson explained the circumstances of the visit. "Colonel Petrov is in London for a series of lectures he's giving at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. He's been invited to share his experiences and perspectives on military leadership and international cooperation. When I learned he was coming, I thought it would be good to arrange a reunion." "I received your letter," Petrov said to James, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "It meant more to me than you could possibly know. I was in a very dark place at that time, struggling to find purpose beyond my military service. Your words reminded me that what we learn in uniform does not lose its value when we retire from active duty. I'm glad the letter helped, sir. I meant every word of it." "I know you did. That is what made it so powerful." Petrov paused, gathering his thoughts. "Since my heart attack, I have had much time to reflect on my life and career. Being forced to step away from active duty felt like a death sentence at first. The military was not just my profession. It was my identity, my purpose, my entire understanding of my place in the world. Without it, I felt lost. Volkov interjected gently. It was a difficult time for all of us who served with the colonel. We could see him struggling to find his footing in this new phase of life. But your letter, Guardsman Mitchell, helped me see things differently. You wrote that military virtue does not end with active duty, that in some ways it becomes more important because it must come from within rather than from regulation. That perspective changed how I approached my retirement. What have you been doing since leaving active duty? James asked. Petrov smiled slightly. Many things. I have been writing a book about military leadership, drawing on my 3 decades of experience. I have been spending time with my family. I have a daughter and 2 grandchildren whom I barely knew before my retirement. And I have been invited to lecture and teach, sharing what I have learned with the next generation of officers. The lectures at Sandhurst are part of that new mission. That sounds incredibly fulfilling, sir. It is, though in ways I did not initially expect. Teaching is very different from commanding, but it has its own rewards. And I find that I have more patience now, more willingness to listen and consider different perspectives. Perhaps my heart attack was my body's way of telling me it was time for a change. They talked for over an hour, with Petrov describing his new life and James sharing updates on his own continued service with the Queen's Guard. Volkov, who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel since James last saw him, described the changes in their regiment and the influence that Petrov's teachings continued to have even after his retirement. Eventually, Thompson checked his watch and stood. Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt this reunion, but Colonel Petrov's first lecture begins in 2 hours, and we should probably have lunch before then. Guardsman Mitchell, would you be able to join us? James glanced at the clock, calculating quickly. I have duty in 3 hours, but yes, I can join you for lunch. They went to a traditional British pub near the guardhouse, one frequented by military personnel, and known for its excellent fish and chips. As they ate, the conversation turned to deeper topics: the nature of military service, the challenges of modern geopolitics, and the ways in which personal connections could bridge national divides. You know, Petrov said, putting down his fork and looking directly at James, when I first encountered you at Buckingham Palace, I saw only what I expected to see: a junior soldier failing to show proper respect to a senior officer. I was blinded by my own pride and my own assumptions about British military culture. And I saw only protocol, James admitted. I was so focused on following the rules that I didn't really consider the human being issuing the command. It was only afterward, thinking about your perspective, that I began to understand how it must have felt from your side. That is the heart of the matter, is it not? We often see uniforms and ranks and nationalities before we see the human beings underneath. It takes a moment of real connection to break through those surface layers and discover the common ground beneath. Volkov nodded. The colonel has been using your story in his lectures, with your permission, of course. He describes it as an example of how cultural misunderstandings can be transformed into opportunities for genuine dialogue and mutual respect. You've been talking about me in your lectures? James asked, surprised and slightly embarrassed. I have been talking about us, Petrov corrected. About how 2 soldiers from different countries and different military traditions found unexpected common ground. About how your courage in saving that woman and child opened my eyes to the deeper qualities that military service should cultivate. About how conflict and misunderstanding can become the foundation for genuine friendship when both parties approach each other with honesty and openness. What has the response been from your students? James asked. Very positive, for the most part. Young officers today face a complex world where they must work alongside military personnel from many different nations. understanding that cultural differences in protocol or tradition do not diminish the fundamental values we share. This is an essential lesson for effective international cooperation. Thompson added, Colonel Petrov's lectures have been extraordinarily well received. The commandant at Sandhurst told me they're already planning to invite him back for another series next year. As lunch wound down and James prepared to head to the guardhouse for his shift, Petrov stood and extended his hand once more. Thank you, Guardsman Mitchell, for the letter you sent, for the example you set, and for the friendship you have offered to an old Russian soldier who did not always deserve it. The friendship has meant as much to me as it has to you, Colonel. More, perhaps. You challenged me to think more deeply about duty and service. You showed me that respect and understanding can bridge any divide, and you gave me this. James pulled out the medallion which he still carried with him every day, which reminds me daily of the values we share. Petrov's eyes grew misty as he looked at the worn medallion. My father would be proud to know that his medal is carried by a man of such character. I hope it continues to serve you well. It will, sir. I promise you that. As they parted ways, with Petrov and Volkov heading to Sandhurst and James to his post, all four men felt a sense of completion, as if a circle that had begun to form months earlier had finally closed. What had started with confrontation had evolved through understanding and was now cemented in genuine friendship and mutual respect. That afternoon, as James stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace, tourists gathering around him with their cameras and excited chatter, he found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The ceremony, the protocols, the traditions, all of these remained important and meaningful. But now he understood them in a larger context, as part of a continuum of military service that stretched across nations and generations. A family with young children stopped near him, the father explaining to his son about the Queen's Guard and their important role. The boy asked if the guard ever moved or spoke, and the father explained that they had to remain very still and focused on their duty. James listened to this explanation with new appreciation for what it represented, not mindless adherence to tradition, but disciplined dedication to a responsibility that connected him to centuries of service. Later that evening, after his shift ended and he had changed into civilian clothes, James returned to his apartment to find an email from Sarah Chen. She was writing to tell him that her daughter Emma, now walking and beginning to talk, had started asking about the soldier who saved us. Sarah wanted to know if it would be possible for them to meet again sometime, and so that Emma could actually see the man whose quick action had preserved her life. James replied immediately, suggesting a meeting in a few weeks when his schedule allowed. As he typed, he realized that the ripples from that single moment of action continued to spread outward in ways he was still discovering. His choice to run toward danger rather than away from it had not only saved 2 lives, it had triggered a chain of events that had brought a Russian colonel and a British guardsman together in unlikely friendship. The next morning, James received one more unexpected communication. It was a formal invitation from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, asking if he would be willing to appear as a guest during one of Colonel Petrov's lectures. And the commandant explained that Petrov had suggested it would be powerful for the cadets to hear both perspectives on the story he had been telling: the Russian colonel's journey from offense to understanding, and the British Guardsman's evolution from protocol-focused duty to a deeper appreciation of the values underlying that duty. James accepted the invitation without hesitation. 2 weeks later, he found himself standing in a lecture hall at Sandhurst, facing rows of young officers in training from Britain and various Commonwealth nations. Petrov stood beside him, no longer in uniform, but still commanding respect and attention through the force of his presence and the depth of his experience. Together, they told their story. Petrov described his initial reaction at Buckingham Palace, his sense of offense and anger, his belief that he was witnessing a fundamental disrespect for military hierarchy. James described his training, his understanding of his ceremonial duties, and his internal conflict during the confrontation. They both spoke about the car accident, the hospital visit, and the gradual building of mutual respect and understanding. But what resonated most with the cadets was not the dramatic moments, but the quieter reflections on what the experience had taught them. Petrov spoke about the danger of letting pride and assumption cloud judgment, about the importance of being willing to reconsider initial impressions when presented with new evidence. James talked about the need to understand not just the what of duty, but the why, to see past protocol to the deeper values it was meant to serve. At the end of the lecture, and during the question and answer session, a young cadet asked what James considered the most important lesson he had learned from the entire experience. James thought for a long moment before answering. "I learned that the uniform we wear, the flag we serve, the traditions we uphold, these are important, but they're not the deepest truth about military service. The deepest truth is found in the values that unite all soldiers, regardless of nationality: courage, honor, duty, sacrifice, and respect. Colonel Petrov taught me that these values transcend borders, and that recognizing them in others, even when those others come from very different backgrounds, is essential to being a complete soldier." Petrov added, "And Guardsman Mitchell taught me that true strength lies not in rigid adherence to hierarchy or in demanding respect, but in earning it through character and action. He also taught me that it is never too late to admit error, to change one's perspective, and to build bridges where walls once stood." The cadets applauded, and as the lecture concluded, several approached to speak further with both men. James and Petrov spent another hour answering questions and engaging in discussions with these young officers who would soon be leading soldiers of their own. It was clear that their story had made an impact, providing these future leaders with a concrete example of how cultural intelligence and mutual respect could transform potential conflict into opportunity. As James and Petrov finally left the lecture hall and walked across the historic grounds of Sandhurst, they paused to look at the memorial to fallen officers from various conflicts and eras. And they stood in companionable silence, each lost in his own thoughts about service, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect soldiers across time and distance. "You know, James," Petrov said. It was the first time he had used the guardsman's given name rather than his rank. "I am an old man now, facing the end of my military career. But meeting you, and learning the lessons our encounter taught me, has given me hope for the future of military service. If young officers like those we just spoke to can carry forward the understanding that we stumbled upon, then perhaps the militaries of the world can work together more effectively than my generation ever managed." "I think they can, Victor," James replied, also using the colonel's given name for the first time. "The world is getting smaller, more interconnected. That we face challenges that no single nation can address alone. Having military leaders who understand how to work across cultural and national boundaries isn't just nice, it's necessary." They shook hands and then, on impulse, embraced briefly. Two soldiers from different worlds, brought together by conflict and bound together by shared values and mutual respect. When they separated, both men had tears in their eyes. "This is not goodbye," Petrov said firmly. "We will stay in touch. You will visit Russia someday, and I will introduce you to my family. They should meet the young Englishmen who taught their old father new tricks." "I would like that very much," James replied. "And you must promise to come back to London regularly. Sarah Chen, the woman I saved, would love to meet you. I've told her about how meeting you changed my understanding of my service." They made their promises to each other, and then Petrov departed for his hotel while James returned to London. As James rode the train back to the city, watching the English countryside roll past outside the window, he reflected on the unexpected shape his life had taken. A year ago, he had been a simple guardsman, focused narrowly on his ceremonial duties and giving little thought to the larger meaning of his service. Now, through a series of events that no one could have predicted, he had formed a deep friendship with a Russian colonel, had his story shared with future military leaders, and had gained a profoundly deeper understanding of what it meant to serve. The medallion rested in his pocket, as it always did, in a constant reminder of the journey he had traveled and the values he had discovered. James knew that his future remained uncertain in many ways. He would continue his service with the Queen's Guard for some time yet, but eventually he would move on to other assignments, other challenges. The lessons he had learned from Viktor Petrov would go with him, shaping not just his military career but his entire approach to life. And somewhere in Russia, Viktor Petrov was embarking on his own new journey, no longer defined solely by active military service, but by the opportunity to shape future generations of officers through teaching and mentorship. The lessons he had learned from a young British guardsman about humility, about the importance of seeing past surface impressions to deeper truths, would inform every lecture he gave, like every conversation he had with aspiring military leaders. Two lives, dramatically different in so many ways, had intersected in London on a summer morning when a Russian colonel had demanded a salute and a British guardsman had maintained his post. That collision of expectations and traditions could have ended in lasting resentment and mutual incomprehension. Instead, through courage, honesty, and a willingness to see each other as human beings rather than just representatives of different military cultures, it had become something beautiful, a friendship that transcended boundaries, a mutual respect that deepened both men's understanding of their service, and a story that would inspire future soldiers to look beyond uniforms and flags to the universal values that unite all who serve. And the Royal Guard, who was ordered to salute by a foreign officer, his reaction of maintaining his ceremonial duty without wavering, had indeed changed everything. Not in the way the colonel had initially demanded, but in a far more profound and lasting manner. It had changed how both men understood their service, had created an unlikely friendship, and had provided a powerful example of how conflict, when approached with openness and mutual respect, can become the foundation for genuine connection and shared purpose. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all, that the strongest bridges are often built in the spaces where walls once stood, and that understanding requires not the surrender of one's own values and traditions, but the willingness to see how those values and traditions connect to the values and traditions of others, so creating a common ground where all can stand together.